On behalf of the Professional Baseball Strength and Conditioning Coaches Society, I'd like to welcome you to the PBSCCS Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Messina. All right, everybody, before we begin this episode, I just want to give a small disclaimer. Terrence and I recorded this interview way back in January during the off season, and obviously it's August now, so there's a lot of things that change over time, and if the dates and some of the things we're saying don't make sense timeline-wise, just know that this is a little bit of an older interview, and that's why there's a little bit of the discrepancy going on. But other than that, the content is really good. I think you're going to enjoy this one. There's a lot of really, really good stuff coming from it. And with that being said, let's get into the episode. All right, everybody. I'm here with Terrence Kennell. TK, thanks for coming on, man. Appreciate your time. Tell the listeners about yourself, if you would, please.
Thanks a ton for having me. Let's see. So currently I'm the head of strength conditioning for UMass men's basketball out in Amherst. Previously, I worked in Kansas City for a professional men's soccer team in WSL. I was with the Houston Astros for a little over 2 years. First year in AA in the minor leagues down in Corpus Christi, good old Port City in South Texas. And then after that was rehab coordinator for about a year, a little over a year or so. And then just worked in London for a while, did a master's there as well. Working in rugby and fighting and basketball. Worked in Japan for a bit, working in rugby. Then went to my undergrad at Arkansas State University down in Jonesboro. I'm sure no one's ever heard of that place at all. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. That's just like the general gist.
Yeah, so you've been around, you've been all over, and like I said off camera, I've followed your stuff for afar, and I've always wanted to have you on, and so appreciate you coming on. And first thing I really just want to kick it off with is just talking about your current role in college basketball and how it compares to your time in professional baseball, just how you're training the athletes, what your day-to-day looks like, and just kind of go from there. So we'll just kind of kick it general and then see where it takes us.
I would say some of the biggest differences I would go with in terms of like general like training in the weight room will be the low-hanging fruit. A lot of times with basketball players tends to be on the strength end, and so I've had probably more focus on just pure strength work than I probably had in maybe the last 2 or 3 years outside of like a rehab setting. It's because that's generally low-hanging fruit basketball players. I mean, like Carl Valley, like people said, the NBA is like no barbell association and stuff like that. So basketball players tend to be allergic to the weight rooms to kind of build that trust a bit early on. That's probably been the biggest emphasis. Another thing was, getting elements like catapult, getting players and coaches bought into using that as well. And we don't get true GPS metrics because we're inside, so we use the metric called player load. So getting players to buy into that and getting to understand a bit like load monitoring, like load management. I know it's like a toxic word in like basketball circles, but essentially it's just like, hey, let's not run everybody into the ground every single day. The time to run everybody to the ground, and the other time we can pull back. So it's kind of been biggest pieces. Adding things like force play to kind of objectify some of our training a bit and see where we can push and pull certain guys in certain directions based on their own needs, and looking at various asymmetries and things like that guys pick up on, especially in sport basketball. There's tons of contacts on a very unforgiving surface like a hardwood court. I'll say about biggest thing is just a general, just pure force and like strength output of being like, hey guys, like we have to tolerate tons of decelerations, reaccelerations, multiple times a week with games for 40 minutes. And then between that, we're practicing, hour and a half, 2 hours. I'm lucky where I don't have, there's a lot of basketball coaches, and if anybody who's worked in basketball before, there's a fair amount of college basketball coaches who push 2.5, 3 hour practices like every day. I'm lucky where I don't have a coach and coaching staff that's like that at all. But so getting to understand that, hey, there's a lot of force we have to generate in basketball. There's a lot of force you need to be able to tolerate and accept and it not break you in the long run. And having some of those conversations of like, it's really just protective, like armor building, essentially, like doing some hypertrophy work, doing some true like strength and chasing some intensity in the weight room, chasing those upper limits of like percentages of like the 85+%, like in the weight room, and be like, hey, it's okay. Like, we can lift heavy and like it won't ruin your jump shot. You'll be fine.
So you mentioned off camera that like this is a new environment for you. They've had other strength coaches kind of in and out.
Yep.
So like when you first started, was it in season or out of season? And like, how are you creating those relationships so quick when they're just used to seeing people in and out of the door?
Luckily, I started off at a good time. I moved here at the end of August, so I had to meet all the staff first, and then the players were back basically like August 30th to September 1st, and we got going with preseason. And I think it just came from just like being kind of authentic and being genuine of like, hey, like I was working in baseball before this, I was working in soccer before this. It's like, have I worked in a team setting in basketball yet? So like, no, I was very upfront about that. I played basketball. It was my main sport growing up. Played up to my freshman year of college. So at like a D2 school, like this, at least they respect kind of that aspect. And then talking to coaches all the time as well, and asking kind of the right questions, asking players kind of some of the right questions of like, hey, what's worked for you in the past, and then how can we facilitate some of those things, and what didn't work, what can we potentially maybe change, whether that be change up like simply as some things like changing a different exercise. We're like, oh, a back squat, like make sure that your low back feel tight, the way it feels. Like we can front squat, it's still a bilateral lower body movement, like something into the world. Like so some of those like just kind of open and honest conversations with players early on and with staff as well. And it's coming off being like, hey, like, yeah, this is my first year doing this in the college basketball setting, but like I've worked in multiple other sports, and so I had to learn and ask a bunch of questions, things like that. And it's probably been the biggest like benefit. And I think starting when I did, like the end of August, like 1st of September kind of time frame, I think helped me too. I can't imagine, being dropped in like November or December when like, oh, you're playing games. You're like, hey, I'm this new person. We're gonna change it the way we train. People be like, yeah, man, fuck that. I don't know if I can cuss on here. My bad.
It's good. It's
okay.
good.
Okay.
Yeah, my first year in pro ball, I started in like the middle of March, which, as you know, is like chaos spring training time. And I just got dropped into like 200 players. I finally got to like make these relationships with players, and then they went to AA and AAA, and I was like, what is this? And they're like, oh, this is extended spring training. And I was like,
yeah,
what the hell is this?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I feel
17
for
and
you.
19-year-olds, and English is not their first language for most of them.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, obviously you're in basketball now, but you know the baseball life. So I'm sure it was super beneficial for you to be able to have that time with the coaches and kind of settle in and just get to know the lay of the land before the players came back versus that like, hey, I'm here, we're playing games. Yeah. Like, what are we supposed to do?
I think will probably help prepare me for that too. Is like when I was working in baseball, I tell players all the time, like I hadn't played baseball since I was like 9 years old. I was fucking awful at it when I played. So I stopped playing it at a pretty early age and didn't like really watch the sport very often. I'd say like highlights, things like that, but didn't follow it like regularly. And I said, those kind of conversations early on and being kind of authentic in that way of like, hey, I'm not going to try and be like, hey, I don't know what on playing means when it comes to hitting. Like asking any coaches like a first day, like, what are you talking about? and so having those I think maybe that kind of prepared me more than I thought it did probably for stepping into this role. And they're like, hey, that was a sport where I had no idea what this sport was like. Like didn't know what the culture was like of the sport. I hadn't played in forever. Didn't really follow it. Had to pick up on a ton of it. Like when I got hired, before I actually like reported, before spring training started. That probably helped me a ton in that sense, coming here.
So when you're in baseball, the guys always make you like play catch or like hop in the cage. Do you ever get to like shoot around with the guys and like, do they talk shit to you? Like, you ever hop in with them and just let them know like, hey, I can still shoot?
Some probably like they'll see us shoot around. We played like some staff pickup before the season started. We played staff pickup, and the players would like just be walking into the building and like video, put it on like Instagram Live and stuff like that, and like watch us play. Because most of our staff, almost staff is way better basketball players than me, pretty much. Like most of them played either they all played Division I or higher. One played in the NBA. Other one, so the others all played overseas for like 10+ years. I'm just out there. I'm just out there doing a dirty work on court.
It gets you street cred though. Like when the players see you
exactly.
shooting around and like, oh, okay, this guy knows what he's doing out there. Like you can throw the ball, you know, you can play catch and make it reach. They're like, oh, okay, this guy gets it a little bit. So,
dude, oh my god, the players will make laugh. Anytime I threw a baseball, players would laugh at me so bad. They're like, "T, you're like." Only reason you don't have Tommy Johns because you don't throw the ball hard enough. it's all elbow flick. There's no
right
rotation
here, just
of the shoulder.
one of these little dart throws. Hey, I got it there. That's all that matters, right? So how about your day-to-day? Like, obviously, I'm familiar with the baseball schedule, and I would say most of our listeners probably know at this point. Like, how does college basketball compare for you to just the day-to-day of professional baseball?
Yes, I'll say it's pretty similar to being like an affiliate in some ways, especially in the preseason. Because in the preseason, I would have, and when guys were like in class right now, we're obviously on winter break, so that's nice. You guys our schedule's easier. But then in preseason, I have to keep the weight room we have our own weight room, which is nice. We don't have like 3 racks in here, you know, a couple benches, stuff like that. It's like pretty like narrow space, but it's quite big. And to keep it kind of just easier as I was starting here was like I kept it in small groups around their class schedule. The guys come to, so I had like groups of like 4 or 5. So I had usually like 3 to 4 groups a day, which kind of mine would be like an affiliate where you have like a pitcher group, position player group. Every now and then, obviously, you have like the relievers who want to get an extra lift in just because they're bros most of the time. And then after that, like me and the coaches talking about practice, what we're doing in practice. Luckily, like my coaching staff, my head coach was very open-minded, and we worked in kind of like a tactical periodization approach of like planning practice and having like high days and low days throughout the week. And so then after that meeting, then you usually have practice in the afternoon. I'm usually done by 4:30, 5 o'clock. Pretty much. I usually my first, if I have a lift group that day, it's usually first group at like 9:30. I may have like 3 of those, like not back to back. Other times like at 9:30 to 12:30, like a 1 or something like that, or 1:30. So it's usually not too busy. So a decent amount of downtime in the day. Here I do things also like order food, like I'm at an affiliate, so like I order a lot of like a pregame and postgame meals. Training table also. We're lucky enough here we're supposed to have training table like a couple of times a week, which is like getting like food for after practice. Myself and the women's basketball strength coach will go to like Target or like Big Y, something like that, like grocery shopping, like fill up like our fridge with like lactose-free milk and like breakfast sandwiches and fruit cups and stuff like that, and we'll make protein shakes. So there are a lot of things that are very much like similar that you do in affiliate for sure.
Yeah, I was gonna say it sounds like affiliate life. And basketball is the only team you're working with there?
Yep. Yeah, so I'm lucky with just like men's basketball only. Like the women's basketball strength coach is the same. He's women's basketball only. And we're also lucky when we have like our own building as well. So like, I mean, sometimes it can be a bit isolating because I don't necessarily see the other or talk to the other strength coaches in the school that much very often. But it's nice is that we can always have access to this building. We have 2 separate courts as well, so own weight room. So planning and scheduling is like super easy on that side of it.
It sounds like a pretty good gig then. It sounds like you're enjoying yourself, and the baseball life kind of prepared you in a way for this current position.
Oh yeah, so as you know, like in an affiliate, you having to wear multiple hats sometimes. So I think it definitely did. So even like things like submitting receipts, like buying food, I was like, oh, I've done this before.
Yeah, I try to say on the podcast, like if anybody can have a chance to work in minor league baseball, like they really should, just because it prepares you so much for so many other things that like you don't really even think about as a strength coach, especially in school. Like they don't tell you like, hey, when you're a strength coach, you got to order meals pre and post game and submit the receipts for reimbursement. You're like, what? Like this wasn't in the essentials textbook.
Yeah, exactly. So there's more so to have to do other than being away from. It's like, oh yeah.
Right. So one of the things you mentioned with basketball is a lot of coaches run long practices. They like to run guys into the ground. And one of the things that I really like on your social media is you talk a lot about conditioning. And I tend to have different views about conditioning than I think most people in baseball. And this might be more baseball centered than basketball, but we can talk general athletics. I think a lot of people in baseball only look to sprinting and they don't look to the other aspects of conditioning and general
100%.
heart rate work and things like that. So let's kind of talk on just your overall thoughts on conditioning, and then we'll kind of get more specific with certain topics here.
Yeah, I think for me, kind of a general principle of conditioning is like it comes. It's like it becomes trendy and not trendy. It's like every year or so of like doing aerobic like conditioning work, and it's like, hey, like that's it's just like the weight room is the reason you do like a GPP block of general basic, not sexy, really boring like weight room work. It's the same thing from the conditioning because the heart is still a muscle, and doing like best way to build a aerobic base is to do volume, and that's okay. And I think, and you know this too, being in baseball, that people instantly hear that they think like, oh, one guy's running poles and like running a bunch of laps around the field. It's like, no, man, you can put them on a bike. Like put on someone on a bike for 30 minutes, have them working like a 125 to 140 beat per minute. Like that's fucking hard. like that's work, and like you can progress that. You can start from even 20 minutes of building that capacity up, and that's really working hard in that zone, and building that aerobic base, because it just does help every other facet of recovery, like your recovery between bouts of intensity on the mound, between swings, and also with baseball, like playing back to back days on field. It's like your recovery between days is so important, and like your ability to recover, have a large aerobic base, and recover between high intensity bouts. Like you don't train that by doing more high intensity bouts. Like you have to have a base for that first. The best way to have a base for that is to do aerobic work. And it's funny, like for Andy Ryland, a USA Football, like he says like that's the real like mental toughness, is sitting on a bike for 40 minutes and be like, hey, don't go higher, don't drop lower, just staying there for 40 minutes. It's like, because it's miserable at times, but the benefit of it and the residual training effect is so important. I think just because simply because it's boring, people don't really want to do it. They'd rather do something more high intensity. They'd rather just run tempos, or they'd rather just sprint, because like sprinting's fun, and also you can do 5-6 reps and be done. No one wants to be like, hey, you're gonna sit in this watt bike for 35 minutes. I'll see you in half an hour. Like no one wants to do that, because I think mentally it's just not as fun to do. But it's so valuable because it does establish that base. And once you've kind of built that up, you don't have to train it and touch it that often, because the residual effect is so long lasting. They can do other things like interval runs, mass work, tempos, high, like more just general sprinting, because it's going to help your ability to recover between those intensity bouts. And if you're on a mound, I think a lot of research shows like with pitching, it's like within just a pitch, I think you get up to like 85% of your match heart rate within like one pitch, and your ability to recover between that, because you have another pitch in 45 seconds to a minute, based on how fast you kind of work as an individual. It's like that's so beneficial. Your ability to throw 95 in the first inning. Well, if you can call it 95 in inning 7 as a starter, it's like that's so valuable. And that's what separates. You see, I'm just saying Astros specific, like the Verlanders of the world. Like he's calling 98 in inning 1 and inning 7. Like,
so I have a ton of like my own beliefs that I want to get into here and kind of talk with you through this. And the original, like you're talking about the tweet the other day from your buddy, and I saw that, and that was like, I saw that and I was like, all right, this is the icing on the cake. Like I'm getting this guy on the podcast. And it was the one about mental toughness for 45 to 60 minutes. And one of the things, I don't know if it was in that thread or the next one, but it was like, everybody says that in the weight room, if you think it's hard, that's what you should do. But with conditioning, it's not the same. Like if it's hard, you shouldn't do it. And like, it's becoming like, when I was a kid, I played hockey. My dad would just randomly take me to the track and just run me into the ground. And it's like, like you said, like I built such an aerobic base that like I'm 29 years old now. I'm way older, but I can touch that every once in a while. And like, it's there. Like it just hasn't left me. And a lot of it is, like you said, that mental aspect of like even hopping on a bike for 30 to 60 minutes. Like I had COVID. We have a spin bike at our place, and I would just hop on for 30 minutes twice a day. Because 1, I had nothing else to do. 2, I was running crazy. But like 3, like it was challenging for me. And like, I think a lot of younger athletes working in like private settings or high school settings are getting to the point where they're trying to train only sprint and only like high output. And it's like, oh, well, pro baseball is this. And people don't realize that, like, yes, one event in pro baseball is like max effort. But like you said, you have to play over and over and over and over again. And like,
you do.
and the thing is, if the 12-year-old kid, 15-year-old kid isn't getting any of that aerobic base work, by the time they get to pro ball, we almost have to like reverse engineer them and be like, hey, we need to build this up or you're gonna break down. Did you see that when you were in pro ball?
I think at the Astros, like most of the players are pretty good about like a lot of them had a pretty decent aerobic work. Their biggest issue was they equated aerobic work to always just running. And some of them had like patella tendonitis, and especially like a lot of pitchers, some patella tendonitis or a guy coming after an Achilles rupture. Right? And it's like, no, so we can get these same adaptations and like an easier on the body environment because we're just searching for the central adaptation of the heart. We're not searching for, let's say, the peripheral load nowhere near as much because of the specificity of obviously pitching. Now, I feel like you're in a court sport or a field sport, it's like I always use a nomenclature of like running is king. Like at some point, it's like a bike's great, a rower is great, a versa climber, but if your sport involves you locomotive motion of running, then at some point you gotta fucking run.
Yes,
you gotta
100%.
so you gotta do some work on your actual feet. But I think definitely you see. I think it's because like sprinting is in vogue. Sprinting and high intensity outputs is like the in vogue thing, and training with the lactate system is the in vogue thing. It's like, it's like that. So no one's saying you shouldn't do that, but you need to earn your right to do that multiple times a week. Because even if you you do sprint work 3 times a week or something like high intensity output lactate work 3 times a week, the trainability of that is going to be less because your outputs are going to start to decrease as that week goes on because you don't recover as well because your aerobic base is shit. So it's like have that general base of ability to recover between bouts, recover between days of high intensity work. Because then it increases your ability to train those high intensity outputs. Like people want to point to the fun side of the Charlie Francis training system of, we sprinted 3 times a week, heavy, high CNS, high day. It's like, yeah, it's low days. It's like Ben Johnson and other sprinters were doing 2 and 3K of tempo on a low day, even up to 35 or 4K in the off season tempo. It's like, that's a lot of work. Like that's a big base of like to get up to that point. And you can't skip the things you don't like to do just because you don't like them.
Yes, 100%. And the thing is, like, there's a lot of people on like social media and, like I said, private settings that look to specific starting pitchers in the big leagues, and they're like, oh, this guy throws 95. I bet he's not running poles. And like the reality is, a lot of those guys do long distance work on their day after they pitch. Like it's just that it's just who they are, right? And they've been able to build that up. And guys that I've talked to are like, some days I don't feel like doing it, but if I do it now, by the end of the season, I'll still have something in the tank because I'll have built that up over the season. Where like, if I feel bad and every single time I feel bad, I just don't do something, like I'm never going to want to do anything, because the reality, especially in the big leagues, is nobody feels 100% ever. No. Like
it's way too long.
Yes,
way too grindy.
The thing is, even in April, you've done 6 weeks of spring training where you're waking up at 6 a.m. every day, you're playing a 1 o'clock game, and then like you totally flip the script to night games right away in April.
I've never understood that. Me and Sports 90 talk about that all the time. It's all along with my director. But why do we start at we're here at 5:45 the rest of 6 weeks, and then just to show up at 11 a.m.
Yes, and that's the thing, is like in April you make that switch and it's like guys' bodies are out of whack, and then they kind of get in sync with the schedule, and then next thing you know, it's May and you have rainouts, and then you start including double headers and things like that, and then it starts getting hotter out, and it's just, there's never a point where you feel 100%. There are days where you're going to feel better than not, but the reality is like you're never going to feel 100%. And then the other thing is, when pitchers are on the mound, especially relievers, and they're throwing in front of 30 or 40,000 people, like the adrenaline is so high that a lot of them start with a heart rate that's elevated. And then not only that, like the reality is a lot of them are probably caffeinated at some point in the day or
caffeinated pre-workout.
Yes, exactly. And so like
smashing C4 in the bullpen.
Yeah, so you know how it is, right? And so a lot of them start with an elevated heart rate to begin the inning, and it's not even like, and then you include the pitching, and then the next thing they pitch again the next day, and then some of them go 3 days in a row. And like, if they don't have that aerobic base, if they don't have that ability to recover, like they're, in my mind, like they're probably going to crash and burn.
Yeah, 100%. It's just like you said, just one of those things people like to jump to, the things, like to cherry pick the things they want to do that are more fun to do. And really, a lot of times, as you probably experienced, the hardest part about getting the guys, especially the starters who do that aerobic work, is getting them to like not do it on feet all the time. So hey, let's not beat up your body as much and your joints. You know, you're 35 years old, you've been in the big leagues for a decade. Like let's get you something else. Like, oh, here's a bike, here's a spin bike, here's a echo bike, a salt bike. Like let's do this instead. Like that's like part of the hard part sometimes.
Yeah, 100%.
People don't realize so many guys, so many pitchers at the elite and sub-elite level really like do like a fair amount of aerobic work.
Yes, yeah, 100%. And the other thing I agree with you is like a lot of pitchers nowadays are just big dudes, right? They're all 6'5", 250, and like it's a lot of pounding on the ankles, the knees, the back, the hips. So like we need to do that work, but it may not be those long distance runs. Sometimes it is longer distance runs. Sometimes you have to mix poles in, half poles, whatever. But like there's other ways to do that, right? And sometimes it's, you know, getting them outside in the sun to run. Sometimes it's avoiding the turf, so we do it inside, right? Like it's dictated by the situation.
Do it in tennis shoes. Tennis shoes. Do it on the outfield instead of the warning track. Just a little softer surface. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, but the big picture is like I don't think that pitchers should be avoiding running, and I think that's a huge narrative right now for people. Is like pitchers don't need to run because they're high explosive athletes, and if you train slow, you're gonna get slow.
Yeah, it's like, man, she's like people are starting to like reiterate the old rhetoric of like, oh, if you do aerobic work, it makes you slow and weak. And it's like, that's just physiologically not true. Come on.
Yeah, well, it's, you know, it's the old, like the picture of Ben Johnson, the sprinter next to the marathon runner. It's like, oh, if you run distance, you're gonna look like this. And it's like the reality for you to be a marathon runner and be good at marathon running, the amount of work you have to put in like far exceeds any amount of like aerobic work we're going to do. Like we ride the bike 100%. A couple of times a week. Like you're not going to all of a sudden be a marathon runner.
Yeah, we'll do a couple like cardiac output intervals of like 3 minutes on, 90 seconds off. Like you're going to be okay.
Yeah, 100%. So it's just selfishly, I wanted to have you on and just discuss this because I think it needs to be said. And like you've been in baseball and I followed your stuff, and I think you're very intelligent, especially with the conditioning stuff, that I thought we needed to have a talk like this. So are there any other like beliefs that you have that are different than like what's popular in vogue or like industry beliefs right now?
I think probably one of the biggest ones that I hate a trap bar deadlift. I'm not a fan of it because I mean some of it is I think some like a false sense of how strong someone is in a lot of ways. But I think also because it tends to lack a lot of the eccentric quality because most people just stand up with it and either like if they hold on to it on the way down, they just like drop it really fast or they just let go. And it's like we need those eccentric qualities. Like those eccentric qualities are important for our ability to accept force and redirect, and that's why it's part of the process too. And a trap bar with 400 for 5 is more fun than a 235 back squat or a 235 front squat for 5. But it's like we need some of those essential qualities too. So that's probably like my biggest hot take is that I cannot stand a trap bar deadlift. I program for like there's a time and place for like anything, and it's definitely nice for like teaching purposes. I've been using a trap bar. I think trap bar is great for like you using that eccentric pattern just because of the stance that you're in. But I'm not a huge fan of like the exercise in general.
The other thing with the trap bar too is you have they're getting bigger and bigger, like the make of them. So like the handles are so high that you're like quarter locking out. You know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
I got 600 on it. It's like,
Did
it
you?
was like high handle, and it was like the perform better bar that's like 25 inches off the ground or whatever. Like, you really, really like, I don't think so. But I agree. Like, there's a time and a place. And honestly, I really like trap bar jumping myself. So like,
yeah, I like trap bar jump.
I think it's kind of that in between of like, body weight jumping exercise and like loaded exercise for guys that I think a lot of people just miss that part of the continuum, right? Like they load super heavy, they do body weight jumping, but there's not a lot of that like in between loaded jumping for athletes. So for me, I really like that. I mean, obviously in professional baseball, as you know, like you're gonna have to use the trap bar with guys. There are plenty of guys that are just not gonna put a bar on their back, which is fine. But like, again, getting them to slow down that eccentric part, or even doing like paused reps or things like that, maybe can help mitigate that.
Yeah,
but
100%. Definitely.
but yeah,
that's something we did for sure. For guys who were like super stubborn about it.
There's definitely those guys that are like, they just want to load it up heavy and like feel like they're lifting heavy. Like, yeah, I did 500. It's like, it's a trap bar though.
Really? Yeah, it's a trap. They're throwing out telling me about, pull 600 pounds. It's like, kind of quarter stood up with it.
Right, 100%.
All right, everybody, that's going to conclude this episode with Terrence. I hope you enjoyed this one. This was an awesome talk for me. I thought there was a ton of really good information, both for coaches that are just moving around and getting into new experiences, and more specifically with the conditioning stuff. So I really enjoyed this one. I thought there was a lot of good stuff to come from it. And then part 2 will have more good information as well. But 3 things that I took from Terrence in this episode: work to learn and understand the language of the sport you work with, understand the desired adaptation that you're trying to get and gear your training towards that, and don't skip out on valuable training tools just because you don't like them. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll talk to you again on the next one.